Hello, everybody, and welcome back to 2BeLikeChrist. Today we're talking about Matthew chapter 15. If you haven't already, do the two things that we do every time we study, and that is go get the notes on the website and link down in the description below. Also, grab the book if you haven't yet. This book is a basic overview of things about the Bible. The book's entitled What is the Bible? You can get it on Amazon.com or free as an ebook on our website, 2BeLikeChrist.com. All right, two important announcements to announce before we begin tonight that are very important. Number one, I have sugar-free Baja Blast. I saw this in the store today and I about had a heart attack. I'm pretty sure my mouth hung open in front of the 12-pack aisle of soda, pop. And so I bought this, so this is going to keep me energized. Also, I'm wearing a hat, which is weird, but my hair looks like a wild animal on the loose running through the savannah. And my wife told me it was just better to keep the hat on, which I kind of agree because it's a little unruly today. So Matthew chapter 15, now that important stuff is out of the way, Matthew 15, we have just a ton to get to. I may split this into two videos if we go really long, but I'm hoping not to do that if I can stay on my notes. So grab those notes offline. Let's go with Matthew chapter 15. Here we go. Then Pharisees and scribes came to Jesus from Jerusalem and said, "Why do your disciples break the traditions of the elders? For they do not wash their hands when they eat." Okay. So this is a good example of a biblical statement that is easily overlooked but shouldn't be overlooked. It says that the Pharisees and the scribes came to Jesus from Jerusalem. Now, Jesus has been in Galilee almost the entire book of Matthew, and these individuals are coming up from Jerusalem. And that is not an insignificant journey, and it's not an insignificant trip for the Pharisees and Sadducees to make. It's about 80 to 85 miles from Jerusalem to Galilee. And so this seems to suggest that Jesus' growing influence was becoming an increasing threat to the Pharisees and the scribes. And maybe they had even called down to Jerusalem to have somebody brought up so that they could kind of counter what Jesus was doing because they weren't having any luck doing it at all. So the attention on Jesus is now spreading throughout all of Israel, not just centrally located in Galilee anymore. So again, 80 to 85 miles probably, and it's not like they were taking the train or driving in their car. On their long journey, the Pharisees apparently were thinking of which question they should ask Jesus to trip him up on, or which accusation they should bring up in order to accuse him and make him look foolish in front of the people. And apparently they decided on hand washing. They asked, why do your disciples not wash their hands when they... Got a typo in my notes, let me fix that. Wash their hands when they eat bread. Notice what they cite here as their authority in this verse. They say, "Why do your disciples break the traditions of the elders? For they do not wash their hands when they eat." So they're citing the authority of the elders and the traditions that they've kind of put in place. That's going to be important when we see Jesus' response. So let's ask also the question, what is hand washing? If you've never read the Bible before, you're not familiar with Jewish history, you might think that hand washing just refers to the common practice that we still go through today where, we wash our hands before we eat. How many times did my mother tell me that I needed to go wash my hands before I eat? I ate after, playing outside with bugs and dirt and things like that, and I hated it, but I did it sometimes. I did, Mother. She's going to be watching this. I did wash my hands, and with soap sometimes, but or we wash our hands after we go to the bathroom, right? So it's a cleanliness practice, and you may think, oh, well, that's what they're talking about here. Jesus' disciples are dirty, and so the Pharisees are trying to get them to clean themselves up. But that's actually not what's going on here. Our modern practice does not represent the accusation that they're bringing up. So Jewish hand washing is known as, I'm going to slaughter this word, but it is Netilat Yadachim. I don't know if I pronounced that right or not. It's in your notes. You can Google it. Actually find a Jewish person who knows how to pronounce it, somebody who speaks Hebrew. And but that's what it's called in their tradition. And the practice is described in great detail in the Talmud. The Talmud is the oral traditions of the Jews. So you have the written law of the Jews, which is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, etc. Those books that are actually written down. And then you have the Talmud, which are the oral traditions. It's kind of like commentary that the rabbis, the scribes, the Pharisees gave, the early Pharisees gave on the written law, how they were to be followed, what the implications of those laws were in other aspects of people's lives. And so this hand washing issue was an issue of the oral law. And it goes into tremendous detail about how this hand washing is supposed to be done. So the practice of hand washing, and I was reading some Jewish sites trying to get my sources or my information from some sources who knew what they were talking about rather than just some Christian sources. The ritual, or the ritual actually originates from a command in the written law in the first 5 books of the second book of the Old Testament, Exodus chapter 30, verses 17 through 21. And it talks about how the priests were supposed to wash their hands in this purification ritual before they went in to offer sacrifices. And I have that whole section of text in your notes. And I think for the sake of time, we're not going to read it. But it talks about how before they sacrificed, they were supposed to go through this ritual washing. And so the origins of the tradition here originated in God's law. And I think that's important to see. But the elders expanded on this command and created traditions demanding hand washing and ritual purification for common Jews doing common things. So they took this principle that they found in one command and then they tried to apply it and bind it on a lot of other Jews for a lot of other things. They required the same ritual purification by water to take place at several occasions. Here's a few of the ones that were mentioned. Before they were eating, so that's probably what the Pharisees are talking about here, and also after they were eating. Also, after they were eating was only sometimes, and an interesting thing that I found was that it was required when the Jews had touched the salt of Sodom, which I believe means that if they ate salt, they had to wash their hands, because salt generally came from the Dead Sea area, and that's where Sodom was thought to be. And the salt that salt then made them impure, and so they had to wash after they had eaten something with salt. I'd never heard that before. I may be misunderstanding that, but I'm pretty sure that's what it was talking about. So before they're eating, after they're eating, when eating certain fruits and vegetables, also after sleeping, and before prayer. And my understanding is that many Orthodox Jews still practice this type of ritual hand washing. And so they created other rituals around this practice. What type of water was required? How much water was required? So you have to have a certain amount of water. Also, your water can't be discolored. It can't be... there's a bunch of different rules around where that water can come from and how pure it has to be. And there's even a rule for how many times you have to pour that water over top of your hands. I believe it's 3 times on each hand. And then as you're doing that, there are blessings that you have to recite, basically memorized prayers or blessings that you have to quote as you're going through this ritual hand washing. And an interesting, I don't know if there's a direct correlation here, but if there's anyone who's ever heard of people who have rules around where water in your baptistry can come from, like if you're baptizing somebody, there are some old traditions about the type of water that you have to use when you're baptizing somebody. Some people say that it has to be living water, it has to be flowing water, like out of a river or a stream or something, like moving water. It can't be like stagnant, and really old traditions about that. And this may be where that came from. I don't have a direct link, but it might be something, if you're interested in that, you can go back and study. So an application here. We need to be careful about taking a principle found in one context and creating rules to bind on other contexts. And I know that this can be tricky because we ought to take principles from the Bible and apply them into our lives. But we do need to be careful in taking a principle that exists in one context and trying to create new contexts in which we are going to bind that on other people. I was trying to think of an example of maybe how that could be done, and one example that I thought of that I had thought about in the past was the idea of dressing up for worship. And this is really, this is an opinion issue, but in my view, it's an opinion issue, and this is my opinion on it. But there's a text in the Old Testament that talks about how the Jews, when God was coming into their presence, I believe it's in Exodus, when they were around Mount Sinai, they were supposed to clean their clothes, get dressed up, they were supposed to be well presented because they were going to be in the presence of the Lord, essentially, or close to it. And I've heard people try to take that principle and say, look, we need to dress our best when we come before the Lord on Sunday morning when we, assemble to worship. And although I think that principle is a good one, I don't think that you can properly take it out of that context in Exodus and then apply it back into New Testament worship. Now, admittedly, I do that. If I preach or I teach or something, I dress somewhat nice, sometimes in a suit. And I like the idea of we ought to present ourselves well when we're doing something that's important. We do that in other aspects of our lives. But can you bind that on somebody? I don't think that you can, as far as saying you have to dress up in nice clothing whenever you are going to come and worship God. Otherwise, you can't do it correctly. I've heard people try to do that. I don't think it applies. I think it might be a good example here of how the Pharisees were kind of expanding on God's commands to bind a principle that existed in one context to another context. And what we find with the whole thing of dressing up for worship is that there's nothing about that in the New Testament. That was an Old Testament principle given at that time because of their relationship with God. Do I think it still is good in some ways? Yes. Do I think we can bind it on people? No, I don't think so. And I know there are people who disagree with me, but that's my 2 cents on that, and I think it's biblical. So the Pharisees weren't asking this question of Jesus, why don't your disciples wash their hands? They weren't asking because they wanted information, that they were genuinely interested. They asked him because they were trying to accuse him of something. So he answers them in the next section. Verse 3, he answered them, "And why do you break the commandments of God for the sake of your traditions? For God commanded, 'Honor your father and mother, and whoever reviles father or mother must surely die.' But you say, if anyone tells his father or his mother, 'What you would have gained from me is given to God,' he need not honor." Let me try to read that again. "But you Pharisees say, if anyone tells his father or mother, 'What you would have gained from me is given to God,' he need not honor his father. So for the sake of your traditions, you have made void the word of God. You hypocrites, well did Isaiah prophesy of you when he said, 'This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men.'" So Jesus doesn't answer their question directly. He doesn't give them an explanation about hand washing, but he returns an accusatory statement to them. Why? You're accusing me of breaking the traditions of the elders. Why do you break God's laws to keep the elders' traditions? Which one of these is more important here, the commands of God or the commands of the elders? And the answer to that should be obvious, right? The commands of God their divine authority versus the commands and the traditions of the rabbis, which are just man's authority, or just that, traditions. Jesus then provides an example of how this was done and how the Pharisees actually practiced this. So God commands, what am I trying to say? One of the 10 commandments is that children should honor their parents, their father and their mother. And Jesus makes it clear that obedience to that command demands carrying out or caring for the parents' needs financially or otherwise. And the punishment for failing to do that in the Old Testament often was death. I mean, it was something that was taken very seriously. There was also a command in the scriptures that required keeping oaths if those oaths were made to God, right? Obviously, when you promise something, you ought to keep that promise. And there were specifically rules in the Old Testament about promises that were made to God himself directly. The Pharisees and the scribes, what they were doing was emphasizing one of those commands and discarding the other one. They were emphasizing the importance of oath-keeping, discarding the commands to honor your father and your mother and to care for them. The tradition of the elders stated that if a person dedicated his possessions to the service of God and made an oath and said, all of the things that I own are dedicated to God in some way or another, they're going to be used for his purposes, his worship, his use. I'm dedicating them. If they said that and made an oath that they no longer had any kind of responsibility when it came to caring for their parents. So if their parents needed something, too bad, because they had dedicated everything to the Lord. And again, this is just some made-up tradition that had come from the Pharisees and the elders. A dedication of this type, as I just said, only exists within the traditional teachings of the Jewish rabbis, not within the Old Law. There's no such Old Testament discussion or promise that can be made that allows a person to do this. It was just a tradition. The Gospel of Mark calls this dedication Corban, Corban, in Mark chapter 7, verse 11. And there's probably a lot of historical study that you could do about that and dig up even more, but for the sake of time, we don't have time to get into that. So their made-up traditions were voiding the words of God. They were elevating the words of their rabbis above the words of God, and Jesus boldly calls them hypocrites for doing this. In this outward pretense of piety, this outward pretense of being holy, they were dedicating all of their stuff to God, but it wasn't because they actually loved God the way that they should have. Their hearts weren't in the right place. Their show of devotion was at heart just a self-serving roundabout means to skirt the commands of God. They wanted to keep all their stuff. And so they came up with this weird, or at least they were abusing this weird tradition that allowed them to do that. I like the way that Albert Barnes in his commentary talks about their hypocrisy. He says, hypocrisy is the concealment of some base principle under the pretense of religion. Never was there a clearer instance of it than this, an attempt to get rid of the duty of providing for needy parents under the appearance of piety towards God. So as we think about some application for that, we need to be mindful that we are not stressing the importance of one command to the neglect of others. So how might that be done? Here's some examples. Many in our Christian culture stress God's instruction to love so much, it's overemphasized so much that they allow it to void God's instruction about admonishing sins, right? We can stress Jesus' instruction to be peacemakers so much that we neglect Jesus and the apostles' commands on church discipline. Right? So there's an emphasis on love or on peacemaking, but it leads us to kind of discard another command of Christ, and we can't do that. We can stress the need. Here's an interesting one I think that hits close to home for me. That is that we can stress the need for Bible study and push out the command to share our faith with others. It's easy to think that we are being godly when we pick up our Bibles to study, but if Bible study consumes so much of our time that we fail to fulfill other necessities, other spiritual requirements, we need to do some evaluation of where our heart is and whether we're really being all that we should be. I find Bible study much more in my comfort zone than going out and sharing my faith with people who may not believe like me. It's much easier for me to sit down on the couch. It's actually comfortable for me to sit on the couch and read my Bible and to feel like, oh, I'm a good Christian. I'm doing my Bible reading today. But if that's overemphasized, if that is so expanded, if we devote so much of ourselves to that we no longer have time or desire to fulfill the other commands that we're required to do, then that's a bad thing. There are times when Christians and when I need to put my Bible down and go do what it says rather than just keep reading. The prophecy that's quoted in verses 8 and 9 is located in Isaiah chapter 29, verse 13. On the outside, the Pharisees and the scribes appeared very religious, but on the inside, they were very far from being what God wanted them to be. Their devotion was vain. And the word vain, a definition, is just producing no results or useless. So there was all this external flourish and ritual, but they weren't producing any fruits. And Jesus said that it's by their fruits that you will know who they actually are, not by their external flourish and ritual. They had lost sight of whose words were most important, theirs or their elders, and or God's. And certain, of course, God's were the most important. Question again of application here, and that is, whose words are most important to you? I think this is an important question to ask for many people in the religious world. Are you quicker to listen to a trusted teacher than to pick up the Bible and read God's word for yourself? Or are you willing to ignore the written scriptures because someone told you that it doesn't apply? Many people pick up their Bible. They think they see something in the text of the Bible. They go ask somebody about it, somebody who is supposed to know things about religion, and that person tells them, oh no, what you read, that doesn't apply for this reason or this reason or this reason. Which are we quicker to accept? The advice of the teacher or the advice of God's word? God has given us a brain to go to his word to find truth. Are we faster to listen to people or to listen to God's word? I think it's important. And see this in the same way that we just saw the Pharisees elevating oral traditions over the written word. Are oral traditions more important to us than God's written commands? The Pharisees and the scribes had a very similar problem to many in the religious world today. How often do you hear a religious teacher cite that some prominent religious figure from the past taught some particular doctrine, and that many after him taught the same thing? And this teacher has been educated at some seminary with some highly educated people, and that he was taught the same thing by them, and that's why you should accept it. So basically what they're doing is they're going back a couple hundred years and they're being like, look at this man. He believed this. He taught these people taught me, and now I'm presenting it to you. That's why you should believe it. There's a couple hundred years of religious history surrounding this doctrine, and so certainly it must be right. What is that? It's oral tradition. Right? Just like the Pharisees were more obedient and willing to elevate those oral traditions above the written law, we today are often more likely to hold to oral traditions of great theologians past rather than going back to the scriptures, to the written law, the words of God himself, and informing our doctrinal positions, our theological views around the written law. So, excuse me. That's not to say that all of the oral traditions, all the teachings of the past are wrong, but they might be. And the only way that we're going to find out what is tradition versus what is written law is to go back to that written law and let that be our reference and our guide. Which is why a study like this one is so important, I think. There's all kinds of people who want to tell you all kinds of things about religion, but there's not a lot of people all the time who will take you to the Bible and bring it all together in context to help you see it. And that's not to, pat myself on my back as I present this material, because I'm doing the same thing in teaching this material. I have never been through a comprehensive study of the New Testament, straight through like we're trying to do. I am trying to piece this together along with everyone else who's watching these videos. And so I think that's why participating in a study like this is so vitally important, is so we can go to the Bible and find out what's written there rather than just having people tell us all the time what's there. I need a drink of Baja Blast. Verse 10 through 11. And he called the people to him, and he said to them, "Hear and understand. It is not what goes into the mouth that defiles a person, but what comes out of the mouth that this defiles a person." So picture this with me. Jesus has just openly rebuked the most respected religious leaders in Judaism in front of all of the people who respected them. That's what's just happened in this text. And a lot of times we don't see that, but on the surface, but that's exactly what's happened. He then calls all of the people over to him, and in front of the Pharisees, he teaches the people the direct opposite of everything that the Pharisees held most dear. Right? This is just savage on Jesus's part. It's like, welcome to Galilee. They traveled 80 miles to get thrashed by this 30-year-old. And I don't think that we should misunderstand the offense that they've taken here, because this is why they're so angry. This is why they're willing to kill somebody who's probably half their age. It's because he is so skilled at dismantling everything that they believe. And, they're thinking, religion, this is our turf. This is our specialty. This is what we study. We're the authorities on this. And yet there's this guy walking around who they just can't even, they can't do anything about him. I mean, he whips them every time they try to take him to school, and he ends up taking them to school. And so what they determine is, look, we just got to kill this guy, because that, rather than accept truth, that's where the position that they were put in took them, when it should have taken them to accept Jesus for being who he was. But understand what Jesus is doing. He's making a mockery of the Pharisees in front of everyone in Galilee. And these guys are supposed to know what they're talking about, but he exposes them and that they don't. In verse 2, I want you to think about how big of a shift. Let's read that verse again. Not verse 2, verse 11. It is not what goes into the mouth that defiles a person, but what comes out of his mouth, this defiles a person. I want you to think about how big of a shift that would have been for a Jewish audience that had been under the Mosaic law, that had often thought of what made you clean or unclean was what was external to you. So in the law of Moses taught that a person was clean or unclean based on their outer surroundings. And it mattered what they touched and what was around them and where they went, and diseases that they had on the outside of their body. All of these external factors could make a person unclean. And so when Jesus says here, it's not what's on the outside of the body that makes somebody unclean, it's what's on the inside, that probably would have been a big dynamic shift for the Jews. And probably a lot of them would have had to scratch their heads. And we'll see in a second that Peter is scratching his head, and he asked the question that probably a lot of the Jews wanted to know, and that is, what do you mean? So Jesus is saying that what makes a person clean or unclean, undefiled or defiled, isn't outside, but it's inside. A person isn't defiled when he eats bread without ritually washing his hands. A person is defiled if his heart isn't right towards God. The Pharisees and the scribes are case in point. And again, you see the harsh rebuke of Jesus here. They are case in point of this very thing that Jesus is saying. They looked great on the outside. Ritually pure. They're over here washing their hands with the right water and pouring it on the right amount of times. And they're reciting the blessings as they're doing that. And they're dedicating their possessions to God so that they don't have to take care of their parents. But all of that on the outside, they're like, oh yeah, we look great. But their insides were rotten. They were actually dedicating their possessions so they didn't have to take care of their parents, and they could skirt the responsibilities that they were given and keep all their money for themselves. They sought loopholes in God's commands. They were hypocrites. Their hearts were very far from God. And Jesus is saying that's what defiles a person. These Pharisees, they got their hands washed. They haven't touched anybody who would make them unclean. They've kept all the Old Testament laws, and they are as unclean as anyone standing here. That's what Jesus is saying. And you can imagine them standing there and listening to that. Verse 12 through 14. Then the disciples came and said to him, "Do you know that the Pharisees were offended when they heard this saying?" It's like, thank you, Captain Obvious. And he answered, verse 13, "Every plant that my heavenly Father has not planted will be rooted up. Let them alone. They are blind guides. And if the blind lead the blind, both will fall into a pit." The apostles of Jesus come up to him and they state what's obvious, and that is, "Do you know you offended the Pharisees?" Like, couldn't tell, they were sulking over in the corner. And Jesus is like, yeah, I'm well aware. An average Jew telling off a Pharisee and a scribe, especially about something about the law, was probably not something that they saw every day. It was probably something that maybe they had never seen. And they were probably concerned about some of the consequences, because these people had pull in the community, and you didn't just go around disrespecting them and not expect to have consequences. They're a little bit worried about that. And Jesus' response is, don't worry about it. Don't worry about those people, because there's many trees which grow in the religious world that are not bearing good fruit. There are some of them. They're not offspring of God, and they were not planted by him. Those who are not born from the seed of the word of God planted in their hearts are not of God. The Pharisees and the Sadducees are those who are described back in Matthew chapter 13, verses 14 and 15, where he talks about, "For this people's heart have grown dull, and with their ears they can barely hear, and their eyes they have closed, lest they should see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their hearts and turn, and I would heal them." That's who they are. They're blind guides trying to lead other people. They're blind to God's message, and yet they fancied themselves as religious experts. And they're leading these other blind people, the common Jews who aren't as familiar with the Old Testament laws as they are. They're trying to lead them. And what happens if a blind person leads another blind person? He says they fall into the ditch, right? That's a doomed journey. And anyone who's under the leadership and the guidance of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, they're on a doomed journey, essentially, if they're being like them. Christ was concerned with honest hearts, and he would not spend his time casting pearls before swine, but he would warn the common people and the blind men, trying to convince them, or he would warn the common people about the blind men who were trying to convince them that they knew the way. And Jesus' point for how many chapters now has been, they do not know the way. They do not know the Father. They cannot get you there. Only I can get you to the Father. Verse 15 through 20. But Peter said to him, "Explain the parable to us." And he said, "Are you also still without understanding? Do you not see that whatever goes into the mouth passes into the stomach and is expelled? But what comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart, and this defiles a person. For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murders, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false witness, slander. These are what defile a person. But to eat with unwashed hands does not defile anyone." Peter approaches, and as we talked about, had this question. Probably others had this question, but Peter's the one bold enough to ask, and he says, "Explain this new concept to us." And Jesus implies that he should know this, but he doesn't, and he goes on to explain it anyway. He says, food can't defile a person. Food is eaten, and it's expelled from the body, right? Put it in your mouth, you digest it, and it goes out the other end. And it's what is allowed to remain in the body and in the heart that defiles a person. This is very consistent with Jesus' Sermon on the Mount and his message about the importance of the internal, not just the external. Lust, adultery, murder all begin where? They begin in your heart. And then because your heart is corrupt, the external action flows from that. Our hearts are either a spring of living water, as John, I think, 7 talks about, or poison water. And external factors cannot influence us unless we allow them entrance through the gate of our hearts to affect its output. So we Let me think before I speak. Our hearts and what is allowed in them is up to us on a daily basis. God calls us to keep our hearts pure. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. So what is on the outside cannot impact us unless we allow it into our hearts. The evil, the corruption that's in the world cannot corrupt us unless we give it permission to remain inside of us, in our minds or in our hearts, symbolically. We can be surrounded by external uncleanliness and not be defiled. And this is the state of a lot of Christians on a daily basis. There's things in our world. There's things when we go to the grocery store. There's things when we go to the movies. There's all kinds of uncleanliness around us. But that doesn't just seep into us and corrupt us. We have to give permission and make our heart a harbor for those things before they can corrupt us. And if we don't allow them to do that, if we see them and expel them from our minds and our hearts, then they don't have the ability to corrupt us. That's what Jesus is saying. We are told that we must live in this world but not permit it to live in us. We are only defiled when we allow sin entrance, or we are not vigilant and it slips in under our notice. Our heart is defiled when it becomes a harbor for wickedness. And if we find our hearts in this state, we need to purify our hearts and our affections. So here's the general principle I think Jesus is trying to get across. What is outside of you cannot defile you in the eyes of God. Only what is inside of you can defile you. Who decides what's inside of you? You do. And so devote yourself to the things of the kingdom and to the things that God wants you to devote yourself to, and you will not be corrupted. The problem with the Pharisees is they haven't done that. Okay, sorry, I had to go grab my iPad because my notes on my computer for some reason didn't update. But let's take a look at verse 21 through 22. And Jesus went away from there and withdrew from the district of Tyre and Sidon. And behold, a Canaanite woman from that region came out and was crying, "Have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David. My daughter is severely oppressed by a demon." You remember at the end of chapter 14, Jesus is on the plains of Gennesaret, which is on the west side of the Sea of Galilee. He now departs Galilee to go northwest. My notes are a mess. I'm going to change that as well. Northwest to Tyre and Sidon. And on the map there, you'll see where that is. So again, not a short journey. This is about 45 miles up northwest in order for him to make this trip. And his intention behind making the trip isn't fully explained to us, but it may have been for the purpose of meeting the woman who we're about to talk about in the next couple verses, and was actually described here in verse 21 and 22. My brain is not working today, so I think I'm going to have to stick pretty close to my notes as we finish this off. Some reason they're not syncing, and I literally just reviewed all of them. So if I'm just looking down at my screen a lot, forgive me. Trying to make this as good a study for you as possible. It's probably too much Baja Blast. That's probably what's doing it. Taste the rainbow. Okay, so this woman comes up to him. Mark calls this woman a Syrophoenician woman. So this woman was not a Jew. She was a Gentile. Jesus is going to make that clear here in a few verses. She cries out to Jesus and addresses him in a very curious way. She calls him the Son of David. And why is that curious? It's because it seems to signify that she knew that he was the Messiah. Son of David is the same title used by Matthew in chapter 1, verse 2, I believe, where he is talking about Jesus, and obviously he knows that he's the Messiah. And that's not going to be just a general Jewish greeting either. Because not all Jews are sons of David. Now, if she said son of Abraham, all Jews are sons of Abraham, but not all of David. So she seems to be aware of his identity, and she addresses him that way. Interesting, because she's a Gentile who's not supposed to be waiting on the Messiah, and yet she does this. The woman comes and she's requesting help for her daughter who was troubled by a demon. Verse 23, but he did not answer her a word, and his disciples came and begged him, saying, send her away, for she is crying out after us. So through all of her crying and pleading, Jesus doesn't respond. He doesn't say anything. And the disciples are annoyed with her and ask Jesus to send her away. Jesus' unwillingness to send her away makes it clear that he's not simply just trying to dispose of her, and that this is an encounter that's important to him. And that's important to remember. A lot of people try to use this text to make Jesus look like he's insensitive, but it's not the case. Matthew chapter 15 now, verses 24 through 28. He answered, Jesus, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. But she came and knelt before him, saying, Lord, help me. And he answered, it is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. And she said, truth, Lord, yet the dogs eat of the crumbs which fall from the master's table. Then Jesus answered and said unto her, O woman, great is thy faith, be it unto thee even as thou wilt. And her daughter was made whole from that very hour. Eventually, Jesus responds after a while. And he makes his mission clear to this Canaanite woman. He says, I am not sent to the Gentiles. I'm sent to the Jews. I'm the Jewish Messiah. I'm the son of David. That's who my primary mission is geared towards. That isn't to say that Jesus never helped any Gentiles, because we've already seen in the book of Matthew that the Gentiles have been the recipients of several of his miracles. I think he says this to this woman to test her faith, and to see how resolved she is to care for her daughter. The woman responds with a statement of great humility. She acknowledges Jesus' mission, and she knew the Son of David was she knew that the Son of David was the Messiah and was sent to the Jews, but she begged that the abundance of the Messiah's blessings, one of them might spill over and be given to her. She's asking for something that doesn't belong to her. That's important, I think, when we look at the overall message of this text. She's asking for something that doesn't belong to her. She's acknowledged that it doesn't belong to her. What is she asking for? For grace. She's asking for grace. And if you know anything about Jesus, you know that Jesus is not really in the business of withholding grace. In the King James Version, verse 25, in the place of knelt before him, the text actually says that she worshipped him, saying, Lord, help me. The way that Jesus replies to this woman, now kneeling at his feet, is a bit shocking. And I think if you don't give it any thought, you can come away thinking Jesus is rude to this woman, or he's racist towards this woman. But if we give it some thought, we can see that not only is that not consistent with anything that we see about Jesus in the rest of his life, but it's not really even consistent with this text, because it seems that he is using this not only as a test of this woman's faith, but to also teach messages to his apostles who would have been there with him. So let's look at this. And also, Jesus' actions in coming to Tyre and Sidon and what he's about to do for this woman are evidence that Jesus does not say what he's about to say in a derogatory way. Jesus says, referring to the Jews, he talks about the Jews as children and the Gentiles as dogs. And he tells her that it would not be right for him to take what belongs to the Jews and to throw it to the Gentiles. So a paraphrase basically would be, it wouldn't be right for me to take what belongs to someone else and to give it to someone who doesn't deserve it. And that's really interesting that Jesus would say that. Because right this very moment in time, Jesus is on a mission to do that very thing. Think about it. He says, it wouldn't be right for me to give what belongs to someone else and to give it to someone who doesn't deserve it. What is Jesus doing on the earth? He's taking what he deserves and what belongs to him as the perfect Son of God. He's suffering and dying to give us, an undeserving group of people, what we don't deserve. So the very thing that he's talking about here And he's saying, it wouldn't be right for me to do this. That's exactly what he's doing in the moment when you look at the grand scheme of God in the plan of redemption. He's taking what he deserves and giving it to somebody who doesn't deserve it. So he comes up with this woman. He says, it wouldn't be right for me to do this. What a great lesson for the Jews. I think this is perhaps intended to teach his apostles a very important lesson. So he has a Jewish audience of disciples who are standing there. And they have been taught what by their religious leaders? We've looked at this. They've been taught by their religious leaders that they were children of Abraham and inheritors of the kingdom of God based on their bloodline, right? Because they were Jews, they were right with God. That's what they were being taught. Our blood keeps us in good standing with God. We enter the kingdom of heaven because we are Jews. They believe themselves entitled to entrance into the kingdom because of their background. This woman, in contrast to that, acknowledges that she doesn't deserve what she's asking for, but asks anyway in hopes that Christ would give her the gift. And so you think about the situation. Who approached God correctly? Was it the Jews who felt that they were entitled, or was it this grace-desperate Syrophoenician woman? And the answer is, this woman did. She understood the place that she was in before God. The Jews did not understand the place that they were in before God. The Jews needed to understand that they were in desperate need for something that they didn't deserve just as much as this woman was. The Jews did not deserve the grace of God. The Jews did not deserve Jesus. But they didn't realize that. This woman desperately needs Jesus, and she knows it. And so, in that sense, the Jews and the Gentiles are in the same spot, both in desperate need of grace. The Jews thought that their blood was everything. The Syrophoenician woman knew that her blood was nothing. And it's only really the blood of Jesus that matters. And that blood was spilled to give the undeserving the grace that they didn't deserve. And, well, coming back kind of to this woman and the way she responds, people in our world don't like to be told that, what this woman was told. You're undeserving of what I'm about to give you. You're undeserving of receiving the grace that you're asking for, or the gift that you're asking for. People don't like to be told that. We live in a world where I hear all the time on advertising and marketing, you should buy this for yourself because you deserve it. You should do this for yourself because you deserve it. You should go on this vacation because you deserve it. You hear that all the time. Listen for it in advertising. People want to believe that they are really valuable in and of themselves, that they deserve things just on the basis of who they are, of being born, I guess. That's not the message of the gospel. It's just not. It's not. The message of the gospel is you don't deserve anything, and God has given you everything. You're a Gentile. Only the Jews deserve stuff. But you're going to get it anyway. I mean, isn't that the message that this is teaching us? That we are not deserving of what we come to Jesus asking for, but he's going to give it to us anyway. And this woman understood that, and it's really a beautiful truth. But people don't like to be told that they are not worthy or deserving of what of something, of anything, right? We like to think that we are really quite valuable and worthy of all kinds of things. And that response would lead me, if I was this Canaanite woman, I'd probably have gotten off the ground after Jesus referred to dogs, and I would have been like, well, forget you. You're a jerk. I don't need to come to you for anything anyway. I'll walk away and just deal with this problem myself. Luckily for her daughter, though, the woman didn't respond the way that I would respond. And upon hearing Jesus' words, what does she do? She humbles herself even further. She says, truth, Lord. You're right, Lord. I don't deserve what I'm asking for here. I know you're not wrong. But if you could give it to me anyway, I'd appreciate it. Right? Give me the scraps of your great glory, and I'll be thankful. And her humility greatly impressed Jesus. And he pays her a high compliment here, saying, "Oh woman, great is your faith." That was probably shocking to a group of people who were standing around Jesus. And how many times had they been told that their faith was great? At least recorded, none, right? What had they heard most of the time instead of, "Oh, your faith is so great"? Most of the time they heard, "Why do you have such little faith? Why is your faith so weak? Why do I have to explain this to you? You should understand this. I shouldn't have to give you an explanation. Why are you coming again to me? Why isn't your faith what it should be?" And here, Jesus is like, "Oh, woman, great is your faith." And they're like, "What is this? This is a Gentile. Why are you complimenting her?" Because of the way that she approached him. And for the reasons I think that we'll look at here in a second. But just imagine that from the apostles' point of view, where they've been hearing the opposite of that for so long, and now Jesus is willing to say this to this woman. And he does what she requests. He gives her exactly what she wants in healing her daughter. So I want to look at two reasons. We've already kind of looked at one to give us a picture of how we ought to ask for grace, but I want to give two other reasons for why Jesus may have traveled 40 plus miles to go up to Tyre and Sidon, when this is the only person that it's recorded that he encountered, the only event that's recorded for us in that whole journey. Why did he do that? First, Jesus may have been using this woman to illustrate the future of the kingdom to his apostles. That would be important because they would be a part of that future kingdom. Jesus had just spent time in Nazareth, in Galilee. And what had occurred there? The Jews had rejected him in Nazareth, and the Jews had rejected him in Galilee, and even sent Pharisees all the way up from Jerusalem to accuse him while he was there in Galilee. Jesus then departs Jewry. I had to use that word at least once. That's an actual word, Jewry. 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 Look it up. It's good. It's a good word. Might not want to use it in public too often, but he departs Jewry and traveled to Tyre and Sidon. And what occurred there, in contrast to Galilee and Nazareth, a Gentile woman came up to him crying and calling him the Messiah. And she acknowledged him as the only one that could help her. Back in Galilee, what do you get? The Pharisees come up to you and call you Beelzebub and acknowledge that they don't have any need for you whatsoever. Is there a contrast between the way that the Gentiles are accepting Christ and the way that the Jewish leaders are accepting Christ? Yeah, there's definitely a contrast. The people who should have known and worshiped the Messiah were the people who didn't. The Gentile who shouldn't have known the Messiah fell down at his feet and worshiped. Does this in any way parallel what we'll see as we follow the Christian story throughout the first century and the history there? Yeah, largely the Jews rejected their Christ, their anointed one, not being able to acknowledge their sinful state, not being able to acknowledge that they needed the grace of God. Paul's later going to write how the gospel was taken to the Gentiles because they gladly accepted the Savior, whereas the Jews didn't. You notice the apostles' attitude towards the two groups of people. I think this is interesting. The apostles came to Jesus earlier in the chapter, and they were concerned that someone had been offended. And who was that? The Pharisees. They're like, Lord, you offended the Pharisees when you said that, right? Contrast that with the way that they approached this woman. On the other hand, the apostles were quick to ask Jesus to turn this woman away. She was there, and they're like, "Send her away. We're tired of listening to this lady whine. If you're not going to do anything, just get rid of her," right? They weren't worried about offending her. They didn't come and like, "Lord, are you going to help this woman? She's over here, and she's, being ignored and might be offended now. You gonna help her?" They're like, "Send this lady away." And it may be that Jesus took them to Tyre and Sidon to help them adjust their thinking about those who were important in the kingdom and those who would accept their message and who they needed to be concerned about. Did they need to be concerned about the swine to whom their pearls were not to be cast? No. They needed to be concerned about the people of honest hearts, the people that Jesus spends his time preaching to. This may foreshadow the Gentile acceptance of the gospel. And this is the second time that Jesus highly compliments the faith of a Gentile. We saw it in Matthew chapter 8, verse 10. Okay, now the second point, and I think this is close. We're getting close to the end here. Second point, and that is to show his apostles an unexpected picture of himself. Maybe that's why he made this trip. Here we see a woman who was born into a low social status, like Jesus. This is a woman who didn't come for her own personal benefit, but to seek the good of someone else, like Jesus. This is a woman who was willing to make herself uncomfortable to accomplish her goal, like Jesus. This woman, when she could have taken offense, humbled herself even further to accomplish her mission, like Jesus. In all of those ways, she is a picture of Christ. And again, coming from a Gentile who's not supposed to know anything about the Messiah or necessarily the Jewish God. And yet all these qualities of that God exist in this woman. All right, verses 29 through 31. Jesus went on from there and walking beside the Sea of Galilee walked beside the Sea of Galilee, and he went up on the mountain and sat down there. And great crowds came to him, bringing with them the lame, the blind, the crippled, the mute, and many others. And they pulled them, I can't read, and they put them at his feet, and he healed them. So that the crowd wondered when they saw the mute speak, the crippled healthy, the lame walking, and the blind seeing, and they glorified the God of Israel. This is a text I think there's a great application in that is, again, often skipped over as just kind of filler information. Jesus returns to Galilee after he's been to Tyre and Sidon, and he goes up on a mountain. We're not told which mountain this was. Maybe it was Mount Tabor, which is one of the mountains we discussed during chapter... Oh, no, we haven't discussed it yet. It's chapter 17, one of the mountains I think the Transfiguration may have occurred on. There's a picture there of Mount Tabor in your notes. That was taken, I think, in the late 1900s, but it's a good illustration of it when it's not, there's not a bunch of modern construction on it. So that sits just to the west of the Sea of Galilee. And that, potentially that could be one of the mountains that he was on. He sits down, and crowds of sick people start ascending the mountain. And I like that picture because it kind of gives you a reference point for what was going on here. So you can imagine people streaming up the sides of that mountain to get to Jesus, who was sitting at the top. Why did he choose to sit at the top when sick people were coming to him? I don't know. But this is the picture that we see. So there's all these people climbing up the different sides of the hills, and they have these sick people with them, and they're trying to get to Jesus. And you can imagine these people, friends carrying the beds of sick people and lame people, other people leading blind individuals around the rocks and over the mud and around the holes. And there were parents probably carrying sick children in their arms up this hill. And there's lepers who are trying to get up the hill and not touch anybody or trying to avoid people while they're going up. And maybe even there was some restraining people with devils and trying to drag them up the hill. And if you've ever drugged somebody up a hill, you'll know that it's a serious, it takes a serious exertion of effort to do that. And it's hard. And these people those who were assisting these sick people were putting them at Jesus's feet, which is, I think, a really beautiful statement as we think about where our burdens need to be laid. Application here. I know we could focus on the sick people. I know we could focus on Jesus. We'll have time to do that as we progress through the Gospels. But let's focus here on the individuals who are bringing the sick up the hill. I don't think it's insignificant that Jesus is up on a hill and they're bringing these people. At least there's a principle here that we can take some application from. So, why did Jesus sit on the top of a mountain? I don't know. Text doesn't tell us. But what we know from that is that it would have required some effort to reach him. Those who brought the sick to Jesus must have cared about those who they were bringing, because this wasn't easy. They had to exert some effort. They loved them enough to exert considerable effort to take them to the only place that they could receive relief, and that was Jesus' feet. if they hadn't loved them, the inconvenience of the hill and the mountain would have prevented them from helping. One of my personal prayers lately has been that the Lord would help me to love people more. Because I think if I loved people more, I would exert more of an effort. I wouldn't be able to look at somebody who was sick, spiritually sick, knowing that Jesus is ready to heal them on the mountain, and ignoring that reality and going about my day without ever mentioning, or even trying to make an effort to bring someone to the feet of Christ. How can we go about our lives like that? Well, I think because probably we don't love people enough. Like these people love the sick. We don't love the spiritually sick enough. And also because it takes effort to do that. Unquestionably, right? Part of the Christian life is bearing burdens. Part of the Christian life is sharing faith with others. And Jesus just outright says that's not going to be an easy thing to do. It's going to be difficult to do. It requires effort. Yes. Does it require personal inconvenience? Sometimes. Does leading people to Christ require you to climb a few mountains to aid them in that process? Yes. And are there some people who you're going to go to and you're going to exert that effort and get no response? No, they're never going to come to Christ, right? They will not go with you. Is that going to happen? Yes. And so there's all this effort that's required. But if we really loved people, like these parents carrying their children up the mountain in their arms, if we really loved people, we'd be willing to exert the effort to do that. And so my prayer has been, help me to love people more so that I can't walk by people and not see them as souls that need healing. Imagine that you're a servant, as we say that we are servants of God. And you say, yes, I want to be a servant as long as I don't have to exert any effort and as long as I'm not personally inconvenienced. Well, you wouldn't be very much of a servant, right? Imagine God has a servant who he has healed and bought with a price. And that servant says to God, oh, I'm happy to be your servant and to serve you as long as I'm not asked to put forth any effort or to be inconvenienced. Are we that servant who would say something like that? I find that I'm really good at coming up with reasons why God's commands aren't asking me to inconvenience myself like that. But am I really going to try to use those excuses when the guy next to me is hauling his sick friend up a mountain to meet Jesus? I think the most convicted I have been of, when there's somebody doing the thing that you're making excuses for why you don't have to do, that kind of tears down your excuses, right? So we need people like that, and we need to be people like that. That way people don't see their excuses as valid. That's what love would demand. That's what love is showing us here in this text as people climb the mountain. And so when we think about loving people who are spiritually sick, effort, inconvenience, personal discomfort, that's what it takes to love someone sometimes. And we've got to be willing to put forth that effort to save those. And so we ought to pray that God would make us love people more and make us more like these individuals carrying the people up the mountain. And, I also wish, just by way of application, that people would see their spiritual needs as much as they see their physical needs. The doctor tells you you have cancer or something like that. You take it really seriously. The Bible tells you that you have a cancer of sin, and we don't always take it that seriously. We need to see them, really your spiritual life as even more of something to be concerned about than your physical life. All right, let's close out this chapter. Whew, this is going to be long. Verses 32 through 39. Luckily, this is a short section. Then Jesus called his disciples to him and said, I have compassion on the crowd because they have been with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. And I am unwilling to send them away hungry, lest they faint on the way. And the disciples said to him, where are we to get enough bread in such a desolate place to feed so great a crowd? And Jesus said to them, how many loaves do you have? And they said, 7, and a few small fish. And directing the crowd to sit down, he took the 7 loaves and fish, and having given thanks, he broke them and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. And they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 7 baskets full of broken pieces left over. Those who ate were 4,000 men, besides women and children. And after sending away the crowds, he got into a boat and went to the region of Magadan. Okay, so you may have read this and been like, wait, didn't I already read this? Except some of the numbers seem like they're different. And essentially, yes, because in the last chapter, Jesus fed the 5,000. In this chapter, he feeds 4,000 other people with a different set of bread and fish. So we see a slight variation there. But basically, we're not going to go over the applications of these verses and dig into those because I think they're largely the same as the last section of Scripture. I don't see a tremendous amount here that is new. And we ask, well, why does Jesus do the same miracle twice? I mean, why didn't he do something else? And I think the reason for that is probably because just like us, the disciples, the people who are following him, need the same truths reaffirmed to them more than once to have them sink in. I certainly know that that's true in my life. Sometimes you have to repeat things to me, or lessons have to be taught to me more than once. And I think that's probably what Jesus is doing here. He heals people more than once in his ministry. And so, and casts out demons, he teaches those lessons repeatedly. He even makes some of the same statements repeatedly in the Gospels. And so that's just human nature. People need it more than once to really get it. And so I think that's probably what he's doing here. So he feeds 4,000 other people with 7 loaves and 2 fish. Right? 2 fish? 7. Oh, a few small fishes. Maybe more than 2. He then travels, as we conclude this chapter, he then travels to the coast of Magdala. I have Magadan in there. I need to change, another place I need to change my notes. But this is probably the same place Mary Magdalene is from. We know that name. And I wanted to include this quote from this individual. It's called The Land and the Book by Thompson. On page 108, I found this quote about the area of Magadan. And this is probably in the same area as Gennesaret, that area, just north of the city of Tiberias. So this is the way that this guy describes this, and I'm going to leave you with this today as a upbeat and happy quote. He says, "This land, it is a wretched hamlet of a dozen low huts huddled into one, and the whole ready to tumble into a dismal heap of black basaltic rubbish." That comes from The Land and the Book by Thompson, and I was like, that's the best quote I've heard all day. So I'll leave you with that, and remember, go out on the website, get the notes if you haven't already, get the book if you haven't already. You can listen to this on podcast, Google Podcast, Spotify, Stitcher, Podbean, Apple Podcast, basically anywhere. And so if that's easier for you to do, you can do it that way. Remember, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Thank you for everyone who's been commenting, and I had some really good thoughts down in there. And share the video. Share the study with anyone who you may want to, and feel free to use the notes if you are teaching a class or Bible study or sermon or whatever you want to do with them. And we can all share the gospel with one another. So thank you, everybody, for paying attention for all this time, and I'll see you guys for chapter 16 next time.